Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, good afternoon. My name is Johannes Kuhlmann. I work in WMO for Professor Taalas. I am welcoming you this afternoon for an event that is held within the Slovenian presidency of the EU, that we have co-organized with the EU and Slovenia on the topic of water and displacement, water and migration. This is an important topic that is sometimes, a bit under the carpet, but I think it is a very timely initiative of our colleagues and friends to discuss this topic in public. This event was meant to be a bigger event where more people would meet and also discuss the topics after our discussions and presentations. We cannot do that now because of the new developments of the pandemic. But we hope that we will have some tangible results and outcomes and maybe some newly established work processes from this meeting. So I don't want to speak much more now. I want to give the floor to our Secretary General, Petteri Taalas, please.
Thank you, Johannes, and welcome also on behalf of WMO and his Secretariat. It's a pleasure to address you, and I would like to thank both the Slovenian European Union Presidency and the European Commission for co-hosting this event. And I would like to also welcome participants from Icrc and Untitled to attend this event. And I'm happy to see my colleague Mami also behind the screens, with whom we have just established a new Center for Excellence on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction. We are just coming out of the COP26 meeting, which was a partly successful meeting, not fully. We were not able to have mitigation pledges that would lead to 1.5 degrees warming by the end of this century. And we are very much talking about temperature numbers, but in reality, the biggest impacts of climate change, they are felt through water. It's very much in Anglo-American language that we use global warming, but that's from my perspective a bit misleading. And we have two major water problems that we are facing today. We have with the higher temperatures, we are having also more evaporation, and that has already led to major problems in Mediterranean region, Middle East, Australia, and also both Americas. And if you look at the climate scenarios for this century, these trends will continue independent of the warming rate. And of course, if we go to higher temperatures, then this will be even more dramatic. The other water-related problem is related to melting of glaciers, and we have just reported that the melting of glaciers has been speeding up, and that means that in the future we are going to get less fresh water for the main rivers. For example, in Asia, for example, in India and China, the population is supposed to suffer from that already during the coming decades. And for example, in Peru, the only source of fresh water is melting of Andean glacier, and so is the case also in some parts of Europe. And the bad news is that since we have already reached, we have exceeded 400 ppm of carbon dioxide, and it's very slow process to remove carbon from the atmosphere. That means that this melting of glaciers will continue for the coming hundreds of years, independent of our success in climate mitigation. We could stop this negative trend in extreme climate events, but the melting of glaciers and snow and ice will continue for the coming hundreds of years. And that's, of course, contributing to the sea level rise, which will be a long-term problem for us. If you look at the disasters, water is again a dominant factor behind disasters. We have just reported that during the past 20 years, there has been 2 billion inhabitants who have been exposed to major flooding event, not only a small, but the major one which has really caused both economic losses and human losses. And 1.5 billion inhabitants have been exposed to drought event, and that has been especially the case in many less developed countries, especially in Africa. At the moment, we are having growth of the economic losses, and at the moment, our estimation is that it's about $250 billion lost every year when it comes to water supply and sanitation. And we expect to see growing amount of refugees because of this water challenge, and it's possible to see fairly soon up to 200 million refugees, and that's also boosted by population growth, especially in African countries. And this negative trend will continue for the coming decades anyhow. And the key issue is, of course, to be successful in climate mitigation, and from UN side we are doing our best to be successful there. But besides that, we also have to adapt to climate change, and investments in early warning services and flood and drought early warning services. They are very powerful way to adapt to climate change. As WMO, we are very much promoting cooperation between hydrological and meteorological services, and build up of common multi-hazard early warning service centers. With technology, we can enhance improve the situation, and that's how to manage the water resources in a more effective way, and we have to monitor what is the status of the hydrological system and outlook, and we are doing such work as well. We just launched a new initiative at the COP26 on water and climate coalition to give a boost to hydrological observing systems services, and also future preparedness of the countries. We were happy to have a high-level panel meeting last week in Budapest, chaired by the President of Hungary, Mr. Ader, who is personally very committed to both climate and water mitigation and adaptation issues. So with these words, I would like to welcome you all to this event, and I would once again like to thank Mission of Slovenia for organizing this, and also I would like to thank European Commission for co-hosting this event. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Taalas, for your welcoming remarks. We have now an event that will go in 2 sessions. The first session will be moderated by Ambassador Pipan from Slovenia, and the second session by our colleague Ambassador Wagner from the EU. So, Your Excellency, can I please ask you to step in and moderate the first part? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Janez, and thank you very much, Secretary General Taalas, for your opening remarks, as well as for hosting us here today at the headquarters of the WMO. On behalf of Slovenia, the country holding the rotating presidency of the Council of the EU this semester, I also would like to give a warm welcome to our distinguished high-level speakers and panelists, to our partners from the EU delegation, as well as participants present in the room and remotely online. We will not directly go to the first panel. We will continue with the high-level keynote speakers. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Janez Lenarčič. He's a fellow Slovenian diplomat serving as the European Commissioner for Crisis Management since 2019. He has held a number of high-level diplomatic posts in Slovenian Foreign Service and the government of Slovenia. He is also a former director of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Commissioner Janez, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Anita. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I'm very much delighted to address you this afternoon in the company of a very eminent group of speakers. Until last week, I was hoping to be with you in person in Geneva. However, the Omicron variant has made that impossible. I'm very much grateful to Slovenia for putting the issue of water and displacement so prominently on the agenda. Both people and the planet need water to survive and thrive. However, water can also be a source of disruption, loss and damage. Floods, landslides, tsunamis, storms, droughts, and waterborne disease outbreaks, just to name a few, are all becoming more frequent and more intense. Water scarcity and disasters may also lead to competition over this precious resource, which in turn can lead to violence and conflicts. And in extreme situations, people may be forced to leave their homes to look for water, or they may be running from water-related disasters and conflicts. The interplay between water and displacement is complex, and so are the solutions and measures to address it. Water has a central place within the European Green Deal, and the European Union has mobilized 2.6 billion euros in water-related investments. With this funding, we continue to invest in water globally for human development, peace, security, and protection. The European Union is also one of the largest humanitarian donors of water, sanitation, and hygiene assistance worldwide. It contributes around 200 million euros each year. This funding ensures timely and dignified access to sufficient and safe water for communities threatened by humanitarian crisis. This year, the Slovenian presidency of the Council of the EU has placed a stronger emphasis on water, and I would like to warmly thank State Secretary Raščan for the work leading up to the Council conclusions on water in EU external action that was presented just a few weeks ago. Today, I would like to share with you a few messages. First, it is crucial to act before disasters and crises strike. Gradually but consistently, we are strengthening our humanitarian support with more preparedness and anticipatory measures. This is a clear objective of our recent communication on humanitarian action, especially in light of the growing impacts of climate change and environmental degradation. By anticipating possible water stresses and disasters, we can act early to protect people and avert, minimize, and address displacement. Early warning systems, risk assessments, disaster risk reduction, and climate adaptation are all essential to support these efforts. Our new approach to disaster preparedness encourages and guides our partners to scale up anticipatory action. Secondly, we need joint and systemic solutions. In other words, the humanitarian development peace nexus approach. As mentioned earlier, water and displacement are interconnected in a complex way. And the complexity and scale of this issue is more than humanitarian organizations can address alone. By working together, humanitarian, development, and peace actors can protect people and transform water from a source of conflict and insecurity to a source of peace and sustainable development. Only together can we address effectively the root causes of water challenges, prevent the onset of crisis and displacement, and build resilience. Thirdly, while the ink on the Glasgow Climate Pact is still fresh, we have to do more on climate mitigation and adaptation. Climate action lies at the heart of our disaster prevention efforts. The evidence cited just now by Secretary General Taalas speaks volumes. We live in a water-stressed world. We have to adapt to present and future risks and prevent other threats from becoming reality. I'm glad to see that the upcoming panel discussion will be about knowledge and the evidence base. The more we know about how water impacts displacement, the better and more robust our policy solutions can be. To conclude, even though the battle against COVID pandemic is not over yet, the time to build back better is now. On this recovery journey, let's keep water and displacement high on our political agendas. Next year, the EU will assume the presidency of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and I look forward to capitalizing on this opportunity to open new avenues of cooperation and to explore solutions. Also in January, we will have the first ever European Humanitarian Forum. We will convene policymakers, experts, and other stakeholders to discuss current humanitarian challenges and strive to chart concrete actions to address them. A session of the forum will be specifically dedicated to climate change, disasters, and displacement. The objective is to gather insights and new perspectives to work on an integrated EU approach on disaster displacement. And I hope to see many of you at the forum as well. I wish you all a successful discussion, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your words and your important messages, including the very concrete items and tools in order for us to address the water-stressed world, such as anticipative action, joint sustainable solutions, climate mitigation and adaptation, and building back better. You have also very much showcased the importance of water in European Union's external policy and shared with us the EU strategic approach on its external action in the water sector, for which I thank you very much. Our next keynote speaker is Dr. Stanislav Raščan, State Secretary at the Slovenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Acting Minister for Development Cooperation of Slovenia. He is a career diplomat with a number of high-level posts. He also served as President of the Executive Board of the Center for European Perspective and President of the Managing Board of the ITF, Enhancing Human Security. Due to previous commitments, he wasn't able to join us live, so the pre-recorded statement will be played.
Dear Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization, Petteri, Taalas, Commissioner Janez Lenarčič, UN Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of UNECE, Olga Algayerova, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by expressing my gratitude to the Secretary General, Mr. Taalas, for hosting this event devoted to challenges concerning water and displacement. The UNHCR estimates that there are currently around 84 million displaced people in the world. The reasons that drive people to leave their homes are various and complex. It is a fact that climate change, water scarcity, and migration are interconnected. Environmental drivers such as degradation of ecosystems, water scarcity, water pollution, and challenging climate play a substantial role in people's being displaced. However, this correlation is neither deterministic nor linear. Localized interplay of climate stressors, water risk, weak coping capacity, and above all, governance factors play a major part. In order to successfully address any challenges, first, we must first understand it well. Informed decision-making is what events such as today's are all about. How do we efficiently employ the tools of development cooperation, water diplomacy, and climate action in addressing the root cause of displacement? To be efficient, our actions must be comprehensive, but at the same time context-specific. integrated approach to water and climate risk call for synergies. This means they must be cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary, ecosystem-based, as well as inclusive, gender-responsive, and conflict-proof. The majority of water resources crosses national borders, making transboundary water management and cooperation determinant for sustainable development and peace. As the current presidency of the Council of the European Union, this is what Slovenia has been advocating, along with the importance of water being at the core of many global, regional and local challenges that range from health to climate change impacts. This comprehensive approach to water has now been embedded into EU external action through the Council conclusions on water adopted by the EU Development Ministers' Council a few weeks ago. With rapid population growth, urbanization, environmental degradation, and the impacts of climate change, water-related challenges will worsen further if we don't act now. Today's event assembles a set of actors who play a crucial role in addressing this challenge. The complexity and comprehensiveness of the challenge demands that we work together in synergy. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
I thank the State Secretary Raščan for his contribution and for emphasizing the importance of informed decision-making in order for us to efficiently employ the different tools, be it development cooperation, water diplomacy, and climate action in addressing the root causes of displacement. Indeed, Slovenia has placed water highly on its foreign policy agenda, and allow me to add some of the Slovenian activities regarding water here in international Geneva. Slovenia is chairing the group of Friends on Water and Peace since January 2020, and we have been addressing different aspects of water-related challenges, inter alia, water and in armed conflicts, water and COVID pandemic, water and data, as well as the transboundary groundwater as catalyst for cooperation. Separately, we have put the issue of water and cybersecurity on the agenda, co-organizing 2 events on protection of critical water-related infrastructure. We also joined the Water and Climate Coalition launched by WMO last year in order to help further promote this nexus, which is not still well established. We are also taking over the role of co-chair of the Water Convention in the period 21-24 and the chairmanship of the same Water Convention for 24-27. I'm pleased that UNED's Executive Secretary will explain more about the Water Convention at the first panel. This ends the high-level part of the event. And I would like to thank the high-level participants for your engagement and leadership on this important topic in the light of 2023 UN High-Level Water Conference. We do need to give the issue of water more political visibility through the engagement of high-level participants of today's conference, inclusive. Thank you very much. And I would like us now to move to the 2 panel discussions. As the global challenges continue and the water crisis accelerate, so does the movement of the people around the world. We hope today's 2 panel discussions will give a better insight into the evidence on links between water and displacement. We also expect this event to add new ideas and recommendations to the existing measures, actions, and policies in order to ensure appropriate responses to the water-related migration and displacement challenges. We are very fortunate to have panelists with us today that have a lot of expertise as well as first-hand experiences with water and displacement challenges. So let's get started with the first panel, where the panelists will talk about the evidence on links between water and displacement. The panelists would make 5 minutes introductory interventions. And at the end of the panel, we will have a short Q&A session. and all participants are welcome to raise their hand, either virtually or in person, or post your question or comment in chat box. Our first speaker is Mr. Robert Mardini. He's Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. He's responsible for steering the ICRC global humanitarian activities and its 20,000 staff in more than 100 countries. During his ICRC career, he served as Deputy Director General, Regional Director for the Near and Middle East, and Permanent Observer to the UN and Head of Delegation in New York. Mr. Mardini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for having the ICRC at this important event, working really at the intersection of armed conflict and increasingly the consequences of climate change and shrinking water resources in many of the places previous speakers referred to. So let me start maybe by saying that unfortunately there is no shortage of events spanning from Vietnam to Kuwait to Kosovo to the burning oil wells in Iraq, which really attest to the degradation and destruction of the natural environment caused by war. For example, attacks can lead to water, soil and land contamination, rendering drinking water and agricultural land scarcer for conflict-affected populations already in desperate need. Explosive remnants of war can further contaminate soil and water resources at times for decades. The destruction of critical infrastructure also breaks down the essential services, including water and sanitation, that populations need to survive. Through our work in Aden, for instance, Aleppo, Benghazi, Gaza, Homs, Mosul, and beyond, the ICRC has come all too familiar with the severe and cumulative impacts on populations when essential services are disrupted. These consequences and environmental damage and essential service disruption for conflict-affected population are severe and complex. People depend on these for food and water. Farmers, herders, and fishing communities depend on them for livelihoods. Individuals and communities try to cope by changing or diversifying their livelihoods, adapting their ways of life, or moving away from their homes. We've seen this again and again at ICRC. Let me share maybe some observations from the field where we see the repeated collision of conflict and disasters. Populations coping with conflict are not spared by climate change, quite the opposite. This exacerbates the vulnerabilities that result from living in a situation of conflict and makes reliable access to water all the more difficult. Some 60% of the 25 countries considered the most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to climate change are in conflict. Recent IDMC data shows that the 10 countries with the highest numbers of people newly internally displaced by conflict in 2020, which are DRC, Syria, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Burkina Faso, Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Somalia, Mali, and South Sudan, also experience disaster-induced displacement. And in the case of countries such as Somalia or Ethiopia, on a large scale. Why? Because countries enduring conflict are ill-prepared to deal with disasters and growing climate risks, as conflicts weaken institutions and communities. In such environments, measures to reduce disaster risks tend to be particularly weak. Disasters are more likely to lead to displacement than in places with solid institutions focused on reducing risks and people's exposure to risks. Let me stress there that climate change does not directly cause conflict. But in the absence of institutions able to mediate tensions and manage resources equitably, climate tensions and instability, climate and environmental degradation may further fuel local tensions and instability and contribute to shaping dynamics of violence, which in turn can lead to displacement. This is the case in many countries where we work. In southern Iraq or in northern Mali, for instance, people commonly experience tensions around access to resources and in particular, water. In other words, people often face multiple threats and these needs to be addressed holistically and locally. What's the role of the ICRC? Well, first and foremost, preserving and ensuring access to water is really at the core of our mandate and work. This can help people stay in their places of origin if they wish so. One of the ICRC's key activities is to engage with parties to conflict to promote respect for international humanitarian law, IHL. Under IHL, the natural environment, including fresh water and drinking water, are protected. IHL also provides crucial safeguards aimed at ensuring that essential services continue to be accessible for civilians during armed conflict. Not only do they protect the critical infrastructure that enables the delivery of essential services, including water and sanitation, but they also protect the civilian personnel who operate, maintain, and repair that same infrastructure. Greater respect for these rules can mitigate some of the contamination of water resources that occurs during conflict, or the attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as drinking water. Through our work, as rains get heavier and shorter, we try to improve the capacity to capture water through building microdams, rehabilitating terraces, and constructing cisterns. We also aim to locate critical infrastructure well above the floodplain to protect it from flooding. We work to improve the management of water, which is needed not only for domestic consumption, but also for industrial, agriculture, and environmental use, and engage in demand-side solutions rather than supply-side solutions. In other words, avoid drilling more wells and drying the water tables. This helps to increase access to water while limiting potential tensions over resources. For instance, in Yemen, we have tried to alleviate the demand for locally shared scarce water resources between villages and in some cases between users. And the aim is to diffuse the source of tension by seeking to make more water available through non-conventional means, such as rainwater harvesting, terracing rehabilitation, spade irrigation. A shift back to more traditional forms of water management is not only more sustainable, but also works to improve food production and livelihoods. This also helps build local resilience to both conflict and climate hazards, while potentially reducing competition over scarce water natural resources. In addition, we are exploring new community-based approaches, notably humanitarian mediation, to address the protection needs arising from local tensions. Clearly, we need to have a sound understanding of social and political dynamics in order to contribute to alleviating rather than exacerbating tensions. Access to water is influenced not only by the availability of water, but also by the equitable allocation of resources. So very quickly, moving forward, it is obvious that to help people cope with growing risks, a holistic analysis, prevention measures, and response are critical, yet the impacts of conflict on the environment and on displacement and the consequences of climate change are often analyzed and tackled in parallel rather than in an integrated manner. We need to change this. And finally, climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction tend to be weak in fragile or conflict-affected countries. This is in part because of the challenges attached to planning long-term responses in such settings, but also the priority is often placed elsewhere. This leaves people more exposed to risk, and we also need to shift this. Thank you, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Mardini, for presenting our CRC's perspective of what happens to people affected by armed conflicts when the environment is attacked or contaminated, and more broadly, when damage to critical infrastructure causes the breakdown of essential services, including water and sanitation. We have also heard very well your call for the need for greater respect of the international humanitarian law. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ms. Olga Algayerova, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Europe. Prior to her appointment, she served as permanent representative of Slovakia to the international organizations in Vienna. She was previously president of Slovak Millennium Development Goals and State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs inter alia. Ms. Algayerova, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anita. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear Petteri, Janez, Stanislav, dear colleagues on the panel. The speakers before me have eloquently elaborated on the important linkages between water, climate, migration, and displacement, so I will not repeat what was said, but would like to focus on two dimensions. The first is the specific challenges, but also opportunities linked to the transboundary nature of water resources. And second, the challenges of providing access to water and sanitation to quickly growing displaced and refugee population. I will also share information on UNEC tools and instruments which can be part of the solution to address those critical challenges. Since water, climate change, and disasters don't respect borders, transboundary basins face challenges in achieving sustainable and peaceful management and are often most vulnerable to climate change. This can compromise the livelihoods of their populations. It is alarming considering that more than 40% of the world population lives in transboundary basins. And even more alarming when realizing that transboundary waters are often the main source of water for populations in conflict or in stable areas such as the Middle East or the Sahel, where instability, water scarcity, and high levels of displacement create an explosive mix. All this calls for a strong cooperation in shared basins. Cooperation is a prerequisite to deal in a sustainable and peaceful manner with the impacts of water scarcity and climate change. It is also beneficial as it contributes to regional integration, peace, and stability. Transboundary institutions are also key, and it is very promising to witness that basin organizations are increasingly becoming agents for peace and change. The Lake Chad Commission deals with complex challenges that encompass not only water and environmental issues, but also security and development dimensions. The Senegal Basin Development Organization was set up to address tensions triggered by periods of drought, since it supported regional integration, including on energy. However, the current level of cooperation is inadequate to deal with existing and predicted challenges. We need more transboundary cooperation and more and stronger basin organizations around the world. So far, only 24 countries worldwide meet the SDG target on transboundary water cooperation. The Water Convention, serviced by UNEC, provides a powerful legal framework and an intergovernmental platform to advance transboundary water cooperation and climate action. The Convention has supported the development of agreements and the establishment of transboundary institutions. Since 2007, it has promoted the development of transboundary adaptation strategies and the implementation of adaptation measures, though guidance and projects on the ground. The global network of basins working on climate change is a prominent hub for the exchange of experience. It is of particular relevance for today's meeting that the first project implemented under the Convention upon request by a new African party, namely Senegal, aims to establish a permanent mechanism for cooperation on the transboundary Senegalo-Mauritanian aquifer. In the face of climate change, this aquifer represents a critical reserve for water in the region. Its use and management will determine the future economic and social opportunities of its population. And I wish to invite all UN member states to accede to the Water Convention and thank Slovenia, the EU, and many other partners for their support to the global implementation of the Convention. Ladies and gentlemen, another major challenge is linked to providing access to water and sanitation to displaced populations and refugees, and guarantee their human rights to water and sanitation. While in the UNEC region, the magnitude of this problem is not comparable to what is experienced in the Middle East, it is a growing challenge. Again, UNEC offers a tool to address this issue. The Protocol on Water and Health provides a framework for the realization of the human rights to water and sanitation. Since 2007, work under the Protocol on equitable access to water and sanitation has led to the development of policy guidance and self-assessment tools that help governments and local authorities in understanding and addressing the challenges of ensuring safe water and sanitation for displaced and refugee populations in Europe. While tools and the legal frameworks are available, water issues are not prioritized enough. Political will remains weak and financial resources scarce. Today's event, but also the recently adopted EU Council conclusions in water in the EU's external action are important positive steps. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Under Secretary General, for describing the importance of transboundary water cooperation for preventing water-related conflicts and sustaining livelihood, thus reducing the risks of displacement. Our next speaker is Ms. Esha Dilip-Zaveri, Senior Economist at the World Bank. She's a member of the Water Economic and Climate Change Global Solutions Group. She has published extensively on issues such as water resource management, climate impacts, and environmental health, and most recently led and authored the flagship report on water migration and development, titled Ebb and Flow. Ms. Zaveri, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just quickly share my screen, and I hope everyone can see it. So thank you so much, Ambassador, Excellencies, colleagues. My name is Esha Zaveri. I'm a senior economist in the Water Global Practice at the World Bank, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to very quickly give you a preview of the key findings of our report, Ebb and Flow, that the World Bank launched in August of this year. It comprises 2 volumes. The first volume, that I will go into a bit more detail, provides the first ever global analysis of the link between water and migration and the implications for economic development. And this is complemented by a regional case study of the Middle East and North Africa region in volume 2, which focuses on water, forced displacement, and conflict. And we're really grateful to the Global Water Security and Sanitation Partnership, GWSP, for supporting this work. And you can download the report at the link that you see on the screen. So without further ado, let me dive straight in. As you all know, migration is big news. It has shaped and carries on reshaping our world in very many ways. And water really has the power to shape these migration patterns. And this is really the thesis of the report. And the two-volume flagship report that I mentioned, Ebb and Flow, released by the bank, it shows us how water interacts with these migration and development patterns that we see around the world. With climate change, understanding these water and migration links has become even more salient. But as you all know, the impacts of climate change are not some distant threat. They are happening here and now. And so in volume 1, we look back into the recent past to examine how this intensifying growing water scarcity and rainfall variability influences why people migrate, who migrates, and where they migrate to, with a focus on internal migration. We employed the largest database on migration ever assembled, along with troves of other data sets. What did we find? Results show that repeated water deficits, so recurring water deficits, they result in 5 times as much migration as periods of excess water. But there are important nuances. And so this really cautions against making any sweeping conclusions. Not everyone has the option to move. And we find that the poorest are oftentimes less likely to be able to move and 4 times less likely to move than higher income residents, and as a result could be stuck in a place with diminished economic prospects. But even as droughts can trap poor people in low-income settings, they do tend to induce migration in middle-income countries. And in these places, the volume finds that those who are escaping droughts usually possess lower education levels and skills than other migrant workers. They are often less advantaged. This means they face lower wages and poorer access to housing and basic services at the destination. Cities happen to be the destination of most internal migrants, but cities are not immune to water shocks. Dozens of cities across the globe, small and big, face day zero type events when water supplies become threateningly low. Yet not all of these cities make international headlines. The volume shows that these types of water shortages can significantly slow urban growth. And paradoxically, migrants might trade one bad situation for another. So how can we turn these water crises into opportunities for resilience? The challenge ahead is to really embrace complementary and long-term policies that broadly follow the principles of the 3 Ps. That is, protect livelihoods, provide people-centered investments, and preserve and sustain water resources at the destination. Let me very quickly turn to volume 2, water in the shadow of conflict in the Middle East and North Africa, which, as you all know, has the highest levels of forced displacement in the world. MENA is also the world's most water scarce region. Despite this, and contrary to popular belief, the volume 2 shows that water scarcity has historically led more to cooperation than conflict. While this does not exclude the possibility of water-related disputes in the future, it does suggest that the cooperative approach needs to be preserved and strengthened. Instead, the volume finds that water itself is more often a casualty of conflict. Water infrastructure is frequently targeted during conflicts, leaving hundreds of thousands of people without access to water. So how can the region move towards water resilience? The report argues that the reality of a prolonged crisis really calls for a shift from a short-term focus on humanitarian support to a long-term development vision that delivers and sustains water resources for the millions of displaced people and host communities for whom water remains a daily struggle. So in sum, both the volumes show that the challenge ahead is to really recognize the complexity of human migration and acknowledge that the ebb and flow of people always in search of water binds the future of all of us. So with that, let me end and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Zaveri, for presenting the World Bank's report, Ebb and Flow, Water Migration and Development. Due to our time restrictions, I would like directly to introduce Mr. Boštjan Rogel. He's a fellow Slovenian, assistant professor at the Department of Geography, University of Ljubljana. His research is focused on international migrations, electoral geography, and critical geopolitics. Mr. Rogel, I would kindly ask you to stick to 5 minutes time frame. And I apologize for doing so. You're the first and you're Slovenian. I give you the floor. Thank you.
I will do my best. I will share my screen. So first, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on this esteemed panel. My presentation highlights the direct and indirect consequences water crisis will have on domestic and international migration flows in what is considered a water-rich country like Slovenia. The amount of water and its availability places Slovenia among the water-abundant countries. The country has humid climate with fairly even distribution of yearly precipitation. It has dense river network and groundwater reserves are plentiful. Despite the general abundance of water, Slovenia occasionally faces a lack of water, mainly because of the shifting climate. In the last 50 years, the average temperature in Slovenia has risen by 1.7 degrees Celsius, and the yearly amount of precipitation has fallen by 10 to 15%. Experts estimate the trend will continue, causing longer and more pronounced periods of summer heat and drought. The country will also face more frequent and intense extreme weather events and weather-related natural disasters. As a result, water shortage could become a bigger problem in the future. So far, changes in water cycles in Slovenia haven't had significant effect on people and economy, but this could change. Migrations are only one area where we could see substantial changes. Since the independence, domestic migration flows in Slovenia are stable. High share of population continuously living in the place or region of birth and modest immigration indicate low level of population mobility, although the country is witnessing growing number of immigration in the last decade. But the numbers are still modest compared to other countries in the region. Since 1970s, Slovenia is an immigration country. Today, around 30% of its population is foreign-born. Vast majority of immigrants come from Western Balkans. Immigration is primarily motivated by economic and social reasons. How could the domestic or global water shocks and water crisis change migration patterns in Slovenia? Well, domestic water shortage could spark migration from certain rural areas to urban and suburban areas. Decline in certain economic sectors, especially agriculture, forestry, and tourism, could lead to higher immigration abroad. Although it is not expected that environmental degradation related to water shortage will become a major factor for immigration, it can become an additional factor. On the other hand, global water crisis could have much more profound effect on Slovenia. COVID-19 pandemic and the so-called European migration crisis have showed us how global crisis can have huge impact on Slovenia. Experts estimate the global water crisis caused by climatic changes will trigger a massive global displacement. Part of the migration flows will be directed towards Europe and towards Slovenia. Because of its location on Balkan migration route, one of the main migration routes for migrants coming to Europe from Asia and Northern Africa, Slovenia can expect higher inflow of economic migrants and asylum seekers. Past experience showed us the majority will only pass our country, but some of them may decide to stay. All this shows that even water-rich countries like Slovenia will be affected by global migration movements caused by the water crisis. So how can Slovenia prepare for the upcoming challenges? It can prepare by acting on national and international level. On a national level, it has to enhance the resilience of communities and economy to water shocks. It also needs to prepare for possible increase of migrants and asylum seekers, especially from non-European countries. Internationally, it must support various regional and global initiatives aimed at combating climate changes. Through technical and financial help, it must assist the most affected, less developed nations to combat the water crisis. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Rogel, for highlighting the direct and indirect consequences of water crisis on the domestic and international migrations in a water-rich country such as ours, Slovenia. I would like to thank the panelists for their interesting presentations. And I would like to invite the participants to ask questions to our distinguished panelists. We have a question from the we have a question from Mr. Brogan, who is asking the WMO Secretary General, Professor Taalas, whether he agrees an IPCC special report on water to include ocean currents like EMOC is needed. Janez will answer this question on behalf of the Secretary General. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. I can only speak on behalf of my Secretary General here. IPCC and water have a tradition. There has not been a special report on water issued in the last couple of years, but of course, with the increasing importance of the topic of water for adaptation, I strongly believe that the IPCC is debating that already. I can, of course, not advise the IPCC to do something or not do another thing, but I am happy to initiate a consultation and discussion with our colleague Abdallah Moxit, who is the Secretary of the IPCC, to see how we can best accommodate this. We also develop in WMO a state of the climate report that we present to COP every year. So we have elements of water in the state of the climate report, and within the framework of the Water and Climate Coalition, we are developing at the moment also a state of the water report that will be hopefully published at the end of next year for the first time, where we will summarize information that is related to the physical changes in our water environment on the globe. And one outcome of this meeting here could be today that between interested member states, the WMO, IFRC and others, we could work together also maybe with the EU to populate such a thing. So there are ample possibilities, and I think it is a topic that needs attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your answer. I think, given the time limits that we have for this panel, I would like to wrap up and maybe ask if any of the panelists would like to make the last recommendation or observation that you would like to share with us. I don't see this being the case. So we have heard how climate change is fueling water-induced migration, and how in conflict-affected areas there are added layers of complexity when it comes to displacement triggers. This gives a good introduction to our next panel on actions to address water climate disaster displacement. Before giving the floor to Ambassador Wagner, I would like to wholeheartedly thank our distinguished high-level guests and the panelists for your insights, and we certainly look forward to working with you on this important topic. Thank you very much, dear panelists. Ambassador Wagner, Deputy Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, I give you the floor now to moderate the second half of today's event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and congratulations for your particularly time-efficient managing of this first part of our discussion. So the second panel is going to focus on solutions, and let me just say by way of introduction how much this first panel showed how central the problem is we are facing, we're discussing today, how much indeed climate change, water scarcity is the kind of driving or kind of defining crisis of our times, and that together with this disaster displacement and as one of its most devastating consequences. And there, I think the discussion also showed clearly two important aspects which clearly feed into now our session. First, it is a very complex issue. All speakers spoke abundantly about that. It is a kind of nexus approach we're talking about with humanitarian aspects, migration aspects, sustainable development aspects, and peace and security related aspects. So it is a central and complex issue, hence the need for a holistic approach to tackle all the different aspects of water-related displacements. And many speakers also referred to the EU's approach, that certainly Commissioner Lenarčič and others also, and kind of highlighted and praised the recent EU conclusions on water. And actually, that's the whole point about, I think, there's a kind of a prise de conscience at the EU level that it is a central issue and that we need to mobilize all our tools to have a kind of water diplomacy and to come to the rescue of those persons in need around the world. And my last point would be by way of introducing now our panelists is that actually we have an excellent hub here in Geneva. Geneva is a hub, a perfect hub of expertise and of not only of expertise, but also of action to try to tackle this issue. With this, I am pleased now to introduce our first distinguished panelist joining us virtually, Madame Mami Mizutori, Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Madame Mizutori will share reflections on how disaster risk reduction can play a role in preventing and addressing displacement. Madame Mizutori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wagner. So many of the panelists of the first panel already have mentioned that disaster risk reduction should be part of the solution to this water-related displacement. We know that it's increasing, and that is why there were so many panels at COP around water and around displacement and their nexus. So I would like to say that we need to think about disaster risk reduction, of course, in the context of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is the global blueprint for DRR, adopted by member states in 2015. And one of the priorities of action of this global blueprint, what they say we need to do in order to address risk drivers, but any risk driver, is to have good risk governance. What does it mean? It means that you need to have a plan, you need to have a strategy, all countries at both the national and local level, on what needs to be done to understand the risks that you are surrounded by and what kind of measures you need to put in place in order to mitigate the risk. So in the context of today, it is quite clear, I hope, that any country that is facing water-related displacement, either the country that is having people being displaced from your country or country that is receiving people who are displaced by water-related disaster displacement, they need to put in their national disaster risk reduction strategy. First, what is the risk driver of displacement? Because they are not one nor two, they are multiple. It can be a combination of many things. It can be a combination of poverty, of informal urbanization, of land degradation, environmental degradation. So you need to understand what is it in our country, my country, that is driving people to be displaced. And then, of course, you need to include a water-related hazard into your strategy. What does it mean? Historically, many countries only put one or two hazards that they experienced in the past in their strategy. But now we know that most countries, in fact, all countries, are experiencing water-related disasters. So they need to put this in their strategy, and they need to understand what is the hazard that they are facing. Is it drought? Is it flood? Is it storm? Or all of them? And once you have these two elements, the hazard related to water and the risk drivers of displacement in your strategy, then you can combine it, the government can combine it and have a risk-informed policy. And you can have what Commissioner Lenarčič mentioned as anticipatory action, not wait for the water-related hazard to strike you and displace people, but put in measures to prevent it. This is the key, this is the foundation, but I would like to introduce 3 specific tools that we have developed with partners around this. So first, this July, UNDRR, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, my office, we launched a special report on drought, which is one of a series of what's called the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction. Now, this report talks about drought happening all over the world, not only in developed countries, not only in Africa, but even in Europe, and how complex the nature of drought is. Complex in terms of its spatial extension, in terms of its time, when does a drought start, when does a drought end, and in terms of how we can respond to it. But that's not the right thing, because what we have always been doing is responding to drought after they hit us. The report says that we need to, again, prevent the drought risks to become a drought, and we need to have comprehensive measures that predict, prepare for, and mitigate drought. And also in this report, we talk about drought-induced displacement. So this is one report, which is actually a tool that can help countries understand better how they can tackle drought risk, which is a big cause of displacement, as explained by our panelists from the World Bank. The second tool is a checklist that UNDRR has developed along with partners, including UNHCR and other humanitarian actors. This checklist tells us how can we integrate disaster and climate risk reduction into humanitarian action. Now, of course, again, as the Development Bank, World Bank panelists told us, we need to not only look at humanitarian action in terms of this topic, but also development. But it is very important that we take care of disaster risk reduction when taking humanitarian action. And this checklist has already been piloted in Haiti, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and is currently being rolled out with OCHA in South Sudan. The checklist offers a pathway to make disaster and climate risk more integral to humanitarian planning, including for displacement settings. So this is also a very important tool. The third tool that I would like to share with you is called a Words into Action Guidelines on Disaster Displacement. This was developed for practitioners on the ground. This was developed in partnership with the German Federal Foreign Office, with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, Platform on Disaster Displacement, IOM, and UNHCR. And what this guide offers to practitioners are how should disaster displacement be integrated into the disaster risk reduction strategies that I just mentioned. It seems simple, but not really. So if you go to this guideline, if you go to this Words into Action, practitioners will understand what can they do, what do they need to do in order to integrate displacement into their strategies and water-related hazards into their strategies. So I hope that these tools will be a valuable contribution to the immense challenge of water-related displacement. And finally, I'd like to mention that in the year 2023, both the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and the International Decade for Water, both processes will complete their respective midterm review. So we, UNDRR, are working very closely with the organizers of the midterm review process of the International Decade of Water, so that we can create synergies between the two review processes and also synergies between the further implementation of the two agendas, including for issues related to displacement. So I will stop here, but I hope that these solutions integrating displacement and water-related hazards into your national disaster risk reduction strategies using the tools that I have mentioned can be a contribution to fighting this big challenge.
Thank you so much, Madam Mizutori, for these valuable and very practical insights and suggestions on how to tackle the disaster risk reduction aspect of this issue. Let me now turn to my neighbor on the right, Mr. Andrew Harbour, Special Advisor on Climate Action at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who will, among others, talk about the use of data and predictive modeling to anticipate future water availability and its impact on displacement. Mr. Harper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And my job has been made much easier with the presentations from all the earlier panelists. And all I can say is that I completely agree with them. And also what was just raised then by Vami in terms of the Sendai framework, the platform and disaster displacement, the words into action. Many of these elements already provide the framework for which we can move much faster in order to, as was just mentioned, predict, prepare for, and mitigate drought risk. So I've got a presentation here, but the focus of that presentation is just to demonstrate that we can actually move forward from the global panels, from the meetings in headquarters in Geneva or New York. And what we've been trying to do is to demonstrate that through collaboration, and as was outlined before, collaborating with cross-nexus across the humanitarian development, peace building and security and human rights divide, that you can build up a community of practice in which to have a more informed understanding of the increasingly challenging world that we've got. So what we've done is in the Sahel, we've put together a consortium in order to anticipate not just the impact of water, because as has been already described, water and the availability of water is dependent on so many different variables. And so just talking about water or talking about displacement or conflict by itself, you go nowhere. You've got to link it all together. So next, please. So we've gone through, there's been quite a bit of discussion already in terms of the linkages between climate, other drivers, whether it be food and water insecurity, but there's also issues related to populations. The big elephant in the room in many parts is demographics. It's also the livelihoods. It's also about environmental degradation. It's also about biodiversity loss. So we need to be looking at all this together to see, okay, what does the future hold to populations? And what is it that is of most importance to these populations in the future? And it's not one size fits all. The reasons why people move in Afghanistan will be different to the reasons why people might move in Mozambique, for instance, or in the Sahel, or in Kenya. So we need to be much more sophisticated, and this is what we've been attempting to do. Next, please. So I won't go through too many of these stats because there's a lot of stats, and stats just indicate that water is important, climate change is real, and the most vulnerable people are going to be most impacted. Next, please. Next, please. I'll try and push through this as much as possible. But you might ask, why is UNHCR so engaged in this? Because at the end of this progression, it's the people who've been displaced by both conflict and by the impact of climate change and environmental degradation, who are probably the best/worst indicators of the inability of the international community to address these challenges. And these challenges, I think that probably the biggest issue that's come across when we've been looking at modeling is that nothing should surprise us anymore. There should really be no excuses. Next, please. So first of all, what we attempted to do was look at what the problems were in the Sahel, and I won't go through too many, but we did an extensive discussion with all the UN agencies that were there. And then what we found was that really there was a lack of data. And if there was data, it wasn't being shared. And if it was being shared, we lacked the analysis and capacity to make sense of it. Next, please. Next, please. So I think the biggest success that we've done in the Sahel is we've brought together a consortium of, I would say, world leaders in each area. And it's not just water, it's not just displacement, because everything is interlinked. We've got people from Potsdam working with Colombia. We've got people working with FuseNet, looking at indicators of famine. We've got people looking at artesian wells. We've got people looking at population growth, because all of this is interlinked. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. This is saving you from going through a lot of boring times and for me to actually maintain my time limit. But I think the population growth there is really important, because you can't talk about access to water unless you talk about how that water is shared per capita. And in places like the Sahel, where we anticipate that the level of water, surface water, may drop by 20 or 30%, then you've also got a population which could double in that same time period. So what will be the availability of water per capita? It's obviously going to be far lower than what it is now. So a big issue is about water management. Next, please. And as was described before as well, it's not only an issue of water availability, it's also what will happen as far as too much water, sea level rises and flooding. Next, please. What will water also mean in terms of food security? And so whether it be crops or whether it be access to, we're talking very much about a human-centric approach, which is important, but humans and populations and communities are also reliant upon food security. And so what does water and accessibility for water mean for these populations? So if you look at areas such as Niger, northern Chad, they may not have sufficient water to feed, to have rain-fed agriculture in many areas. This will and can already be modeled out. So what do we need to be able to do to mitigate that impact? Next, please. And I know that I've got to wrap up very quickly here. And I'll probably finish it, maybe the next one, please. So this is just to show you that we're not only looking at what data we have, but we're looking in order to anticipate, as the first panel was discussing, it's no use just looking at the present. What we have to do is position ourselves 10, 20, 30 years ahead and look what will be the state of these regions. What will be the level of temperature? What will be the level of the environment, the populations, the food security, access to potable water, also issues of governance. It's often not discussed enough, but if you don't have governance, you don't have proper water control, water management. And so all these elements come together to describe the state of play, not only now, but in the future. So what I'll basically conclude now is, but to underline that there is the capacity to bring a wealth of knowledge, analysis, and data together to better inform the decisions that we have in the future. And so it's for us now to raise our ambition rather than continuing to react to, again, another drought, another flooding, to say now's the time to actually put words into action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this, and actually for putting those spotlight very concretely on Sahel, which is actually, I mean, if there is one region in the world where very concretely this link between water and the displacement is so obvious and so dramatic also, then it's probably also Sahel. So it puts some tangible figures on what we are talking about right now. Next speaker would be, if he's with us, is our colleague from IOM, Mr. Manuel Marquez Pereira, Head of Division for Migration, Environment and Climate Change, who will give us IOM's perspective on links between water and displacement. So the floor is yours. I think you're muted, at least for me.
Yes, good afternoon. Allow me to share a small presentation to you. I don't know if you can see, let me see. Can you see?
We see you, but we No.
No. Maybe it takes a bit.
Give it another try.
Not sure if you can see it. Technical problems.
We can't.
No. Okay. So I will go probably without the presentation to thank you for allowing me to talk today. From IOM, and following up what our colleagues have already said, and there's no need to extend too much beyond all the points that were already made. I would like to make some statistics on the table just as a conversation. As our colleague said, that 2/3 of disasters recorded between 2020 and 2020 were water related. It's a significant amount of challenges that we see across the world. And it would be very significant that if we put these in relation with the amount of people that also don't have access to clean water, we have largest amount of people at the risk of being displaced, not only for scarcity, but other questions. More so, as our colleagues pointed, there are 260 million people that live in areas that are particularly susceptible of sea level rise. And if we see that into 2020, more than 14 million people were displaced alone in 2020 by floods, with storms accounting for as many. IOM looks at this problematic within our broader migration, environment, and climate change policy on 3 pillars. The first is we develop solutions for people to move. We work on frameworks and assistance to facilitate migration from areas affected by water scarcity or relocation by sea level rise. We also work to support policy development on migration pathways, humanitarian visas, or displacement management to help strengthen government's capacities and solutions for people that need to move. We work with governments on developing solutions for people on the move, namely people in displacement scenarios, where we implement programs on flood controls, riparian corridors maintenance, and wash assistance in these displacement settings. In 2020 alone, IOM delivered wash services with our partners to over 21.5 million people in 53 countries. And we work also with governments and communities to support labor mobility and skills diversification for migrants and IDPs to adapt to the areas where they are moving or are displaced. At the same time, it's very important to allow communities to stay where they are if they want so. And so we work to develop solutions for people to stay. Disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation projects to ensure not only that people can live safely in areas exposed to water-related risks, but also the sustainable management of water resources and livelihoods. Evacuation facilities, rehabilitation and construction, capacity and governance systems to address floods and cyclone impacts are some of the other programs. Allow me to give a few examples of what is happening in critical locations around the world. First, in South Sudan, IOM conducts systematic monitoring of groundwater resources in Bentiu and Wau, aiming to ensure that there is a sustainable use of water by the displaced communities. The Sud is one of the largest wetlands in the world, covering approximately 20% of the country. During the wet season, communities are secluded, trapped in islands, and others move along with their cattle to drier areas until water levels recede. To mitigate flood risk and overcrowding, IOM and partners developed a technical intervention with reservoirs to keep IDPs camps drier. In Mozambique, supporting government capacity building and community level preparedness for floods and displacement management, supporting communities on accessing water trucking in the cases of acute water shortages, or supporting the development of infrastructures for better and cleaner access to water. In Afghanistan, flood mitigation infrastructures, gabion wall protections with community work to ensure that flooding and flood controls are based on hazard mapping in flood-prone areas that would try to avert new displacements, supporting the development of transitional shelter constructions using local and vernacular technologies, including disaster risk reduction improvements for better coping with the elements in a structural way, establishing early warning systems at community level, and supporting the national government to establish warning systems and data understanding. Or in Bangladesh, supporting the government with its new policy on national displacement management and the implementation of better data and analysis capacity across the country. But in other areas, supporting the renovation of evacuation shelters and the capacity building of community disaster management committees, together with the Bangladesh Red Crescents and the country cyclone preparedness program. And finally, in Yemen, in partnership with other organizations, supporting drought management and understanding, including conflict resolution in Al-Fara, where farmers and communities have come together to create conflict resolution communities, including men and women, to find solutions to community violence. After heavy rains, also in the region of Marib, the reservoir in the vicinity had significant concerns over the flooding of the areas further south of the basin. And so in support with government and Dutch entities, risk assessment and remote sensor dating was made to determine mitigation measures. Flood simulations were performed, and these informations were used to preparedness actions across the affected areas. And finally, in the Philippines, where anticipatory action for the impact of cyclones with OCHA and SURF is being piloted, but also the renovation of evacuation centers and the capacity building of communities for faster and more effective temporary evacuation relocation movements. Disaster risk reduction programming in very vulnerable areas across the Pacific line, and strengthening government support and response preparedness to disasters, including data collection and analysis on displacement and risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marques Pereira, for making the case actually that different situations require different solutions, and that what we're talking about precisely is there is no one size fits all approach, and that each specific region, each country, each situation needs a specific toolbox to tackle this water displacement issue. Thanks a lot. And finally, but not least, I am pleased now to give the floor to Professor Walter Kellin, envoy of the chair of the Platform for Disaster Displacement, PDD, joining us virtually. And Professor Kellin will provide us with examples of water-related cross-border displacements and an overview of existing legal tools to admit and protect cross-border displaced persons. Professor Kellin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. After an extended period of drought in southern Angola, nearly 900 Angolan citizens, mostly children, lactating mothers, older people, arrived in northern Namibia in March of this year. Many were suffering from malnutrition. Local communities and the Namibia Red Cross provided assistance. The government of Namibia engaged with Angolan authorities to explore possibilities for return once the drought would be over. Some years ago, in January 2015, a cyclone hit the southern part of Africa. It triggered severe flooding, and this flooding prompted displacement in both directions across the border between Malawi and Mozambique. The two governments closely cooperated to assist their respective citizens on the other side of the border before they could return when the waters receded. And hypothetically, in a future probably not too far away, citizens of the country X, a low-lying atoll island state, might seek refuge in other countries because their own country has become uninhabitable due to the effects of sea level rise. 3 examples, 3 types of cross-border displacement linked to water issues. But we have to keep in mind that a very, very large majority of people displaced in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change remain within their own country. They become internally displaced persons. And we could also talk about what could be done for them. The UN Secretary's high-level panel on internal displacement recently came out with their report. And without going into the details, it is important to highlight some of the messages, such as the need for a whole-of-government approach, such as the need for a whole-of-society approach, such as the need to move from mainly humanitarian approach to solutions to development, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction oriented approach to solutions. But my 3 examples show that show that people may also be displaced across borders. And I would like, in my short presentation, to address 3 questions. First, what are the circumstances that actually displace people in water-related contexts? And when are these people not just internally displaced, but when do they cross borders? And finally, what are available tools we already have now to address such displacement? Without going into the details of the rather sophisticated models presented to us by Andrew Harper, in a simplified way, we can say that people have to leave their homes if they are exposed to a hazard, and if they are too vulnerable or otherwise lack the capacity to withstand the impacts of the hazard and cope with the damages caused by the hazard. Thus, it's the interaction of these 3 elements, the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability caused by many, many different factors. It's the interaction of these 3 elements that trigger displacement. As Andrew already has mentioned, displacement in the context of disasters and climate change is always multi-causal. And in this equation, water plays the role of the hazard which triggers the disaster, which then forces people to leave their homes. As illustrated by flooding and drought, water becomes a hazard when there is too much of the water or too little of it. In the case of heavy rainfall, the water comes from above. In the case of sea level rise, it comes from below. Second, while most people remain within their own country, displaced people are fleeing across borders in basically 2 types of scenarios. The first type is moving to another country is the only way to save one's life. That's the so-called sinking island scenario, as I said, in a probably not too far away future. But the example of Malawi and Mozambique, which I mentioned, also show that sometimes for people living in border areas, the only escape routes lead to the neighboring country. So saving lives as the cause of cross-border displacement is important. But then cross-border displacement also occurs where, as illustrated in my Angolan example, where people do not have access or cannot obtain the necessary humanitarian assistance in their own country. So they seek it in a neighboring country. This leads me to my 3rd question. What are the available tools we have, the available legal tools? Well, if you look at the media, then one would say these are climate refugees. But as Andrew Harper would have explained had he been asked that question, most of these people do not qualify as refugees. True, even in the context of disasters, persecution might happen, and where conflict and disasters overlap, very often these people are qualified as, are recognized as refugees. But overall, there are many other countries. None of my 3 examples falls into that category. And here, people clearly are not refugees. So refugee law is not the main instrument to protect these people. So what tools do we have? First, there is domestic law, something we often forget in our discussions. But in the Americas, many immigration laws provide that people affected by disasters may be admitted or that they may stay temporarily for humanitarian reasons. Guatemala and Mexico, for instance, provide for humanitarian visa and entry permits to people affected by disasters. Argentina, another example, grants entry and temporary protection to persons who are not refugees and thus not in need of international protection as defined in refugee law, but, and I quote, temporarily cannot return to their countries of origin by reason of the prevailing humanitarian conditions or due to the consequences generated by natural or man-made environmental disasters. Most other countries in the Americas have similar legal provisions. However, their use is often not predictable because it's up to the discretion of immigration authorities whether they want to grant humanitarian visa and temporary protection or not. And the criteria are quite different from one country to another. This is why we at PDD, Platform on Disaster Displacement, together with IOM, have been supporting Central and South American countries to develop guides and guidance to effective practices in order to harmonize, to make more predictable what they already have in their laws. Another domestic law tool is the creation of quota for people from affected countries, quota for temporary, circular, or permanent migration. We have examples, for instance, in the Pacific region, in New Zealand and Australia, addressing people from affected Pacific Island states. These quotas are not just limited to climate change. It's a mix of economic, humanitarian, development motives, but again, interesting. But it's domestic law. It's not legal obligations on the basis of international law. Such obligations, binding obligations, may arise from regional agreements on the free movement of persons. Such agreements, in fact, are usually or always economically motivated. We don't want to really address the issues we're discussing here. But we have seen that, for instance, in the ECOWAS region, when there is flooding or drought, people use the ECOWAS free movement of persons agreement to go to neighboring states, sometimes to find work there, send money back to their families and communities, go back later, or settle permanently. Interestingly enough, very recently, IGAD, the sub-regional organization for the Horn of Africa, adopted a protocol on the free movement of persons, which now contains a specific article on disaster displaced persons. It says that this agreement on the free movement of persons can also be used and accessed by people anticipating disasters, during disasters, or affected by the long-term impacts of the disaster. And because usually these people do not possess the required documentation, national passports, etc., the IGAD protocol also states that instead of the necessary documentation, these people will be registered by the state receiving them. Very interesting, one example, but it could be expanded. And finally, we have human rights law. Not that much, but many of you might have heard of the recent decision by the UN Human Rights Committee in the case of Teitiota, person in New Zealand, a person who came from climate change affected Kiribati, who claimed that due to sea level rise, his life would be threatened in his country of origin, and therefore he could not be sent back. The committee accepted that in a situation where impacts of climate change and sea level rise would make the country uninhabitable and thus threaten the life of persons, such return, forcible return, deportation would amount to a violation of the right to life. In the specific case, however, they concluded that the situation as of now has not reached that level of severity in Kiribati. But the decision might inspire regional courts that can adopt binding decisions. Human Rights Committee only can provide views in individual cases, non-legally binding. But the case also might inspire domestic courts, and we'll see how this human rights approach will further develop. You might say, and I'm concluding with this, that, well, there's a lot, so should we worry? Of course, all is not good. All of what I said is haphazard. It exists here, but not there. It might be applied now, but not next time. And what we really need is to further develop all these approaches, all these tools. The Global Compact on Migration provides for that kind of discussion. And I think what I've just said, the further development and generalization of these tools should be a topic that should be very important on the agenda of the follow-up to the Global Compact on Migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kellen, for this and for actually shedding the light also on the very important work the platform does on all this, and maybe also to say how much we're looking forward as an EU to take over the chairmanship of this very important tool as of the second semester of next year, and looking forward to work with you also in particular. So this is our last panelist, and looking now, it's time for, I think we have time for maybe one question, and I saw actually one very interesting question which might also trigger answers from some of our panelists here. It's a kind of a cross-cutting one, which is the type of predictive analytics and need for anticipatory action you discussed. And the question is how much actually this awareness have trickled now in the mindset of the donors, governments, UN actors, and the implementing partners. So that's maybe a question to some of our panelists. What does it take? What's your assessment on that? What is the level of awareness as we speak amongst those who have to do the job, and what does it take to increase that awareness, and what are the barriers or catalysts we could possibly use to have a more like structured response on water displacements? Is there any volunteer amongst our panelists to tackle this? I see Andrew on my right, please.
No, thanks, and thanks for the question. I think there's a huge amount of interest on getting evidence in terms of how that could inform the future scenarios. Why I'm saying that is that even before we have finished with the modeling, the Special Coordinator for Development in the Sahel is using the scenarios and is already putting them in place for the processes informing the integrated strategy for the Sahel. So this is exactly what we wanted. So, and also just to give you an example from last week I was asked to provide a presentation of the results of the predictive analytics to the informal expert group on climate and security to the Security Council. And then the next day I was asked to provide a briefing to the teams on the ground in the Lake Chad Basin. And that includes not only the UN agencies, but the government authorities and NGOs. So the interest is from the ground, which is particularly important, to the highest levels. So if we say the data is there, the partners are there, and the enthusiasm and willingness to use it now, then what is stopping us to expand it and replicate it elsewhere?
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I think Madame Mizutori wants to come in also on that question. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Wagner. So there is an enormous amount of awareness and interest in doing much more anticipatory action, as Andrew just mentioned. From the donor community, there is a very strong focus on early warning, early action for multiple hazards and risks, including food security related risks, including drought risk, including flood risk. And for this, we need to have a system that works across borders in regional, sub-regional context. And there's a lot of support and funding that is going into creating these early warning systems and units within the countries, specifically in Africa, in the case that I know, for observing and gathering data. But the interest, as Andrew says, is also coming from the ground too, because UNDRR is working with the African Union Commission and also IGAD in order to create these early warning and early action systems, which can trigger anticipatory action. So I do believe that we are now on a very, very solid trajectory of focusing more on anticipatory action. And I think COVID has done a lot to it. COVID has increased the awareness, the importance of prevention. And I believe that the awareness for more prevention that has been raised by COVID is also now being applied for awareness to be more preventative for all other disaster risks. And I think this can contribute largely to mitigating displacement by water-related hazards.
Thank you so much for this. I don't see any other questions. And maybe just pick up on what both our panelists just said. It's kind of a heartening kind of acknowledgement that actually awareness is happening and that it is now the case. We are at a point where everybody, I think all decision makers, be it governments, certainly organizations, NGOs, civil society, recognize that it is an issue, it is a central issue, and that we need now to move on from the phase of assessment, the phase of analysis, towards precisely this type of holistic policy need for holistic policy developments. And again, I think we are here in Geneva, and certainly the panel today showed this very clearly. We are in a very good position to do so, at least to bring the debate forward. And maybe that's also the moment just to pay tribute to our colleague from the Slovenian mission, how much the Slovenian EU presidency has put this so-called water diplomacy at the forefront also of our preoccupations globally, but certainly also here in Geneva. And the event today, really, I mean, is a very timely one, and it is basically also just a moment for us to assess collectively, like we did today, and but to see it also as a kind of a milestone towards further action, certainly next year and the following years, to keep this issue of water displacement at the heart of our multilateral agenda. Before closing, I see Professor Kailin also wanted to come in on this specific point, and then I think it's time to wrap up.
And thank you very much, Ambassador. Not on this point, but the question that was in the chat box addressed to me, namely the question regarding the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol. I'm asked, what are some of the gaps you may have identified and needed to be improved by the ECOWAS Commission and its member states in relation to the discussion? Question by Batura Kamara at CESI. What we have seen is that simply crossing borders is relatively easy for disaster-affected people in the ECOWAS region. But beyond that, lots of issues, lots of gaps. The previous chair of PDD France, is presently funding a project we are implementing with IOM, UNHCR in this region that, for instance, looks again at the issue of data, of knowledge, of the dynamics. That's one gap. Another gap is what happens to people once they have crossed the border. We do not really know that much in terms of solutions, in terms also of the migration management and all the challenges that creates for receiving countries. So lack of knowledge and issues related to migration management are probably among the biggest gaps, together with the question of what kind of long-term solutions for these people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Keiling, for answering this last question. And sorry for that. That's the beauty of moderating hybrid events. You don't see everything which is happening on the screen and in the room at the same time. So sorry for that. So this concludes our meeting today. Thank you very much to all of you in the room and also to our many listeners who have been with us today. And again, looking forward to work on this very important issue also in the coming month in years here in Geneva. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
If I may just add one sentence, I would like to thank everybody for your active participation and insights. This, of course, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to ensure that those most vulnerable to water and climate-related displacement, that their rights and security are guaranteed. And I also wanted with this opportunity to say that for those of you and for the panelists, for those of you who are here, the Slovenian presidency prepared a small gift that you can take at the exit of while going out of this meeting. Thank you very much.